Some loves are tested by time, but Charlotte Brennan never imagined hers would be tested by a stranger's greed. After 43 winters together, she thought the hardest thing she'd face was watching her husband Otis slip away, piece by piece, as his mind began to fade. High in the Montana mountains, their hand-built cabin has sheltered them from everything the wilderness could throw at them. Otis was once the most feared trapper in the territory, but now he struggles to remember which tool cuts kindling. Charlotte tends to him with the same fierce love that carried them through decades of harsh winters and lonely summers. When railroad baron Montgomery Blackwell arrives through the swirling snow to collect an old debt, he expects to find a broken old man. Instead, he finds Charlotte weathered by mountain life but still graceful, still strong. His demand is simple but cruel. The debt disappears if she leaves with him. What would you sacrifice to save the one you love most? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning that changed everything began like any other in the 43 years Charlotte Brennan had spent on Wildcat Ridge. She woke before dawn to the familiar sound of wind rattling the shutters and Otis's steady breathing beside her. At 68, her body still rose with the mountain rhythms, early to bed when darkness fell like a curtain across the peaks, early to rise when the first hint of grey touched the eastern sky. She slipped from beneath the heavy quilts her grandmother had stitched, her bare feet finding the worn wooden planks of the floor she and Otis had laid board by board in the spring of 1882. The cabin held their history in every timber, every careful joint. Otis had felled each tree himself, shaped each beam with an adze that now hung forgotten on the wall, its purpose lost, somewhere in the fog that increasingly clouded his mind. The kitchen held the warmth of last night's banked fire. Charlotte stirred the coals to life and added kindling from the neat stack beside the hearth. This ritual never varied: coffee first, then breakfast, then whatever the day demanded of them. In earlier years, that might have meant checking trap lines that stretched for miles through the wilderness, or splitting enough wood to last a 3-day blizzard, or mending harness for the pack mules that carried their pelts down to Millerville twice a year. Now the days held gentler rhythms. Otis could still split kindling on his good days, though Charlotte had learned to hide the larger axe. After the morning she found him staring at it with confusion, unable to remember what it was for. She'd discovered his trapping journal last winter, leather-bound and thick, with decades of careful notes about weather patterns, animal behavior, and the precise locations of his most productive sets. He'd opened it one day and wept like a child, because the handwriting looked foreign to him, though it was his own careful script recording 40 years of wilderness wisdom. Charlotte measured coffee into the pot and set it on the stove, listening to Otis stir in the bedroom. She could tell by the sound whether he was having a clear morning or one of the confused ones. Today the movement seemed purposeful. She felt her shoulders relax slightly. "Morning, Charlotte girl." His voice carried the familiar rasp that spoke of countless mornings calling across frozen valleys. He appeared in the doorway in his long underwear and wool socks, his grey hair standing in wild tufts. At 71, he remained a big man, though the mountain hardness had softened into something more fragile. His hands, once steady enough to set a trap in driving snow, now trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. "Morning, my love." She filled his cup and watched his face for signs of the man she'd married. Some days she saw him clearly, the fierce, gentle soul who'd built this life with her. Other days she saw only confusion and the terrible fear that came with not recognizing the world around him. Today his eyes held recognition and something else, a shadow of worry that made her stomach tighten. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, settling into his chair by the window. "Been trying to remember it proper, and it came clear to me in the night." Charlotte poured her own coffee and sat across from him, noting how his hands shook as he lifted the cup. "What is it, Otis?" "That debt, the one I told you about." His voice grew smaller. "I remember now why I had to borrow that money." She'd heard fragments of this story before, pieces that never quite fit together into a complete picture. Something about needing money fast, about traveling down to Millerville to meet with someone who could help. But the details always slipped away from him like water through his fingers. "It was when you took sick," he continued, his eyes fixed on something beyond the frosted window. "That winter, when the fever nearly took you. Doc Patterson said you needed medicine that couldn't wait for spring, medicine that cost more than we had." The memory came flooding back to Charlotte, the pneumonia that had settled in her lungs like lead, the weeks when she'd burned with fever while Otis sat vigil beside their bed. She remembered fragments, his face haggard with worry, the sound of him praying when he thought she couldn't hear, the bitter taste of expensive medicine that had somehow appeared when she began to recover. "How much, Otis?" She kept her voice gentle, though dread was building in her chest like storm clouds. $5,000. The words came out like a confession. "With interest, it's grown to near 8,000 now." Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. $8,000 might as well have been 8 million for people like them. Their entire yearly income from trapping and the small garden barely reached $300, and that was in good years. "Who did you borrow from?" "Man named Montgomery Blackwell. Railroad money. He had an office in Millerville. Said he helped folks in desperate situations." Otis's hands were shaking harder now. "He was kind then, Charlotte. Said he understood what it meant to love someone so much you'd do anything to save them." She reached across the table to cover his hands with hers. They'd weathered so much together, brutal winters that killed livestock and weaker men, summers when drought withered their garden and drove game deep into the high country, in lean years when they'd lived on little more than hope and each other's stubborn love. "When is it due?" she asked. "Contract said 10 years, with payment whenever we could manage." His voice broke. "Charlotte, that was 8 years ago. I kept meaning to make payments, but every year something happened. Bad winter, poor trapping, needed money for seed or supplies. I kept thinking next year would be better." She understood. On a mountain homestead, next year was always going to be better. It had to be, or you couldn't survive the hoping. "Maybe we can work something out," she said. "Sell some land, or there's more." Otis pulled his hands free and stood, walking to the window. "Man rode up here 3 days ago while you were visiting the Morrison place. Said he was Montgomery Blackwell, come to settle accounts." Charlotte's heart stopped. 3 days ago? Why didn't you tell me? I kept forgetting. Every time I tried to remember, it would slip away like smoke." He turned to face her, and she saw the man she'd married, lucid, present, and terrified. "He's coming back today, Charlotte. Said he wanted to see our situation, evaluate our assets." The coffee turned bitter in her mouth. Assets. They owned their land outright, 40 acres of steep timber and rock that provided everything they needed but had little value to anyone else. Their few head of livestock might bring $100. The cabin itself, built with sweat and love, but no thought of resale, would be worthless to anyone who hadn't built it themselves. "We'll face it together," she said, though her mind was already racing through impossible calculations. "We always have." Otis nodded, but she could see him slipping away again, the momentary clarity fading like morning mist. By noon, he might not remember this conversation at all. By evening, he might not remember Montgomery Blackwell's name, but the debt would remain, solid and immovable as the mountains themselves. Charlotte spent the morning in a whirlwind of activity, cleaning the cabin with unusual intensity and inventorying their possessions with new eyes. The hand-carved furniture Otis had made during their early years might have some value. Her grandmother's china, carried west in a wagon and somehow surviving decades of mountain life, could be worth something to the right buyer. But even their most precious belongings would barely dent a debt of $8,000. She found herself touching things with new awareness, the mantel clock that had been her mother's, the silver-backed brush set from their wedding, the leather-bound books they'd accumulated over the years. Each item carried memories that money couldn't measure, but memories wouldn't satisfy a debt collector. The sound of approaching horses reached them just after noon. Charlotte looked out to see two riders emerging from the tree line, one on a magnificent black stallion that picked its way delicately through the snow, the other on a more practical mountain horse, loaded with supplies. "He's here," she called to Otis, who was dozing by the fire. He startled awake, confusion clouding his features before memory returned. "The debt man?" "Yes." Charlotte smoothed her hair and checked her appearance in the small mirror by the door. After 43 years of mountain life, she harbored no illusions about her looks. Her face was weathered by wind and sun, her hands roughened by work, her figure softened by age and the hearty food necessary for survival at altitude. But her eyes remained clear and intelligent, and she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who'd never backed down from a challenge. The knock, when it came, was firm but polite. Charlotte opened the door to find herself face to face with Montgomery Blackwell, and her first thought was that he looked nothing like what she'd expected. He was, perhaps 55, tall and lean with iron-grey hair and intelligent dark eyes. His clothes were expensive, but practical wool and leather chosen for warmth rather than display. When he removed his hat, she noticed the care with which he'd groomed himself for this remote journey. This was a man accustomed to comfort, but not afraid of discomfort when necessity demanded it. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, his voice carrying traces of Eastern education softened by years in the West. "I'm Montgomery Blackwell. I believe your husband told you I'd be calling." "Mr. Blackwell." She stepped aside to let him enter, noting how he stamped the snow from his boots and waited for permission before crossing her threshold. "Please, come in." He entered their small main room and looked around with what seemed like genuine interest rather than the calculating assessment she'd feared. His gaze lingered on the hand-hewn beams, the careful craftsmanship of the furniture, the books lined up on their shelves. "You've built something remarkable here," he said. "I can see why you'd want to protect it." Otis had risen from his chair, confusion and wariness battling in his expression. "I remember you," he said slowly. "You loaned me money." "I did." Montgomery's voice held surprising gentleness. "You were desperate to save your wife's life. I respected that desperation." "I haven't forgotten the debt," Otis said, though Charlotte could see him struggling to hold on to the thread of the conversation. "I mean to pay it." "I'm sure you do." Montgomery turned back to Charlotte. "Mrs. Brennan, might we sit and discuss the situation? I've ridden a long way, and I suspect this conversation will be difficult for all of us." Charlotte gestured toward the table, automatically moving to pour coffee for their unexpected guest. As she set the cup before him, she found herself studying his hands, clean but calloused, suggesting a man who'd known work despite his obvious wealth. A simple gold band on his left hand spoke of marriage, though something in his eyes suggested loss. "The debt stands at $8,400, Montgomery began without preamble. "Principal plus 8 years of compound interest at 6%. The number hit Charlotte like a physical blow. "That's more than we could earn in 20 years, she said quietly. "I know." He sipped his coffee, studying her over the rim. "I've made some inquiries about your situation. You own this land free and clear, but it's not easily developed. Your livestock are healthy but few. The cabin is well built, but has no value beyond this location." Each word felt like another nail in a coffin. Charlotte kept her voice steady. "What are you proposing, Mr. Blackwell?" "I'm a practical man, Mrs. Brennan. I didn't ride up here expecting to collect $8,000 from people who clearly don't have it." He set down his cup and leaned back. "But I am a businessman, and debts must be satisfied one way or another." "Just say what you mean," Charlotte said. Montgomery looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "You're not what I expected," he said quietly. "What did you expect? A beaten woman, someone broken by hardship and ready to beg." His eyes never left her face. "Instead, I find someone who's clearly the strength of this partnership, someone who's spent decades building something meaningful from nothing." Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. "Mr. Blackwell, my husband borrowed money from you in good faith. We intend to honor that debt, but we need to understand what you're asking of us. The debt is forgiven, he said simply. For a moment, Charlotte thought she'd misheard. I'm sorry? The debt. I'm prepared to forgive it entirely. Montgomery's voice was calm, businesslike. In exchange for one thing, the relief that had begun to bloom in Charlotte's chest withered instantly. What? You come with me? The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Charlotte felt the world tilt slightly, as if the solid foundation of her life had suddenly revealed itself to be built on shifting sand. I don't understand, she said, though part of her understood perfectly. I'm offering you a different life, Mrs. Brennan. Comfort, security, medical care for your husband when his condition worsens. Montgomery's voice remained steady, reasonable. In exchange, you leave this mountain with me. You're talking about my wife, Otis said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that Charlotte recognized from his younger, fiercer days. I'm talking about a business arrangement, Montgomery replied, though his eyes never left Charlotte's face. One that benefits everyone involved. Charlotte found her voice. You're insane. Am I? Montgomery leaned forward slightly. Look around you, Mrs. Brennan. Look at your husband. How much longer can you manage this life alone? What happens when winter traps you here, and he has one of his confused episodes? What happens when you're both too old to chop wood or haul water? Each word hit home with surgical precision. These were the fears that kept Charlotte awake at night, the questions she'd been avoiding as Otis's condition slowly worsened. This is our home, she said. It's a beautiful prison, Montgomery's voice softened. I'm offering you a key. At what cost? At the cost of choosing yourself for once, instead of choosing sacrifice. He stood, moving to the window that looked out over the valley they'd called home for nearly half a century. I've done my research, Mrs. Brennan. I know about the medicine money, about the years you've spent caring for everyone but yourself. I'm offering you a chance to be cared for instead of always doing the caring. By a stranger. Strangers become friends. Friends become more, given time and opportunity. He turned back to her. I'm not proposing marriage, Mrs. Brennan. I'm proposing a chance at a different kind of life. Charlotte felt as if she were drowning. The reasonable, practical part of her mind could see the logic in his offer. The debt was impossible. Their situation was only going to get worse. Otis would soon need care she couldn't provide alone. But the larger part of her, the part that had spent 43 years building a life with the man she loved, recoiled from everything Montgomery Blackwell represented. I need time to think, she said. Of course, Montgomery moved toward the door. I'll be staying at the Peterson place down the valley. You have 3 days to consider my offer. And if I refuse, then I'll pursue collection of the debt through legal means. His voice held no threat, only statement of fact. Foreclosure, seizure of assets, eviction, the full weight of the law. He paused at the door, hat in hand. Mrs. Brennan, I want you to know that this isn't about cruelty. It's about recognition. I recognized something in you the moment I walked through that door, something I haven't seen in years. What's that? Life, he said simply. Real, vibrant life. Not just existence, not just endurance, but genuine vitality. It would be a shame to see that buried on this mountain. After he left, Charlotte and Otis sat in silence for a long time. The fire crackled in the hearth, the wind continued its eternal conversation of the eaves, and their world, their safe, familiar, beloved world, felt suddenly fragile as spun glass. Charlotte, Otis said finally, his voice small and lost, I'm so sorry. She went to him then, kneeling beside his chair and taking his hands in hers. Don't apologize for saving my life, but now I might lose you anyway. You won't lose me. She spoke the words with all the conviction she could muster, though uncertainty gnawed at her heart like winter cold. We'll find another way. But as night fell and they prepared for bed, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that their life together, the life they'd built, log by log, season by season, choice by choice, was already slipping away like snow in a spring thaw. Outside, the wind continued its ancient song, and somewhere down the valley, Montgomery Blackwell sat in a borrowed room, waiting for her answer. The promissory note lay spread across their kitchen table like a death warrant, its formal language as cold and unforgiving as the February wind that rattled their windows. Charlotte stared at the document Montgomery had left behind, her eyes tracing the careful script that spelled out the terms of their doom. Borrower agrees to repay the sum of $5,000, with interest compounded annually at 6%, for a term not to exceed 10 years. Below that, in handwriting she barely recognized as belonging to the man she'd married, Otis had signed his name with the shaky desperation of someone watching his wife die. "I remember signing it," Otis said quietly from his chair by the fire. His voice held a clarity that had become increasingly rare, as if the weight of their crisis had burned away the fog that usually clouded his thoughts. "My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the pen." Charlotte traced the signature with her fingertip. She could see the fear in every wavering line, the love that had driven him to pledge everything they owned for her life. "Tell me about that day," she said. Otis closed his eyes, and for a moment she thought he'd slipped away again. But when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of perfect memory. "You'd been sick for 3 weeks. Doc Patterson had done everything he could, but the fever kept climbing. That last night, you started talking to your mother, the one who died when you were 12. You kept asking her if it was time to go." Charlotte remembered fragments of those fevered days, the feeling of drowning in her own lungs, the terrible heat that no amount of cool cloths could touch, and yes, the strange conversations with people who'd been dead for years. She'd felt herself slipping away, being pulled towards something peaceful and dark. "I couldn't lose you," Otis continued. "Not after 25 years together, not when we'd finally got the homestead running right." He opened his eyes and looked directly at her. "Doc said there was a new medicine, something from back east that might help, but it cost more money than we'd seen in 5 years. So you rode to Millerville, left you with Mrs. Peterson, and rode hard through the night. Got to town just as the stores were opening." Otis's hands worked restlessly in his lap. "Asked everywhere about borrowing money. Bank wouldn't talk to a trapper with no collateral except land they couldn't sell. Store owners just laughed." Charlotte could picture him desperate, proud, watching precious hours slip away while his wife died slowly on a mountain. "How did you find Montgomery?" "Bartender at the Silver Dollar said there was a man staying at the hotel who sometimes helped folks in desperate situations. Rich railroad man who understood what it meant to love someone." Otis's voice grew bitter. "Seemed like Providence at the time." "What was he like then?" "Different. Younger, maybe, or maybe just less hard around the edges." Otis struggled to find the words. He listened to the whole story without interrupting. Asked about what you were like, how long we'd been married, whether we had children. When I told him we'd never been blessed with young ones, just had each other, he got this look in his eyes. What kind of look? Like he understood exactly what that meant. Otis stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered valley where they'd built their life. He counted out the money right there on his hotel room table. $5,000 in cash, more money than I'd ever seen in one place. Said the terms were generous because he respected a man who'd do anything to save his wife. Charlotte felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February cold. "He knew about me even then." "Must have. When I got back with the medicine, you started improving within hours. Doc Patterson said it was a miracle, said he'd never seen someone come back from so close to death's door." Otis turned to face her. "I thought we'd been blessed. Thought some angel had put Montgomery Blackwell in that hotel, just when we needed him most. And now I think maybe the devil's been patient." The words hung between them like smoke. Charlotte picked up the promissory note again, studying the signature of the man who'd saved her life, only to claim it 8 years later. "There has to be another way," she said. "We could sell the livestock, maybe some of the land." "Charlotte." Otis's voice was gentle but firm. 40 acres of steep timber and rock. Our handful of cattle and that old milk cow. We'd be lucky to get $500 for everything we own. She knew he was right, but admitting it felt like surrender. The cabin, who'd buy a cabin that's only accessible by horse trail? Who'd want to live this far from everything? Otis sat back down, his momentary clarity beginning to fade. We built this place for us, Charlotte. Built it to last forever. Never thought about what it might be worth to strangers. Charlotte stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the life they'd carved from wilderness. Every fence post had been set by their hands, every garden row planted with their sweat, every improvement made with love and hope for the future. The idea of strangers valuing it only in dollars felt like blasphemy. "What do you think he really wants?" she asked. "I think he wants what any lonely man wants." Otis's voice carried a sadness that cut her to the bone. Companionship. Someone to share his wealth with. Someone to make him feel less alone in the world. But why me? He's never even met me before yesterday. Maybe that's why. Otis struggled with the words. Maybe he's been thinking about the woman whose life he saved for 8 years. Maybe he's built up some idea of who you are, what you might mean to him. The thought made Charlotte's skin crawl. To be someone's fantasy, someone's imagined salvation, it felt like being reduced to an object rather than honored as a person. "I won't do it," she said firmly. "I won't leave you, and I won't be bought like livestock at market, even if it means losing everything. Everything we have doesn't matter if we don't have each other." Otis was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was so soft she had to strain to hear it. "What if I don't remember you anymore, Charlotte? What if this thing in my head gets worse and I become a stranger who doesn't know your name?" The question pierced her heart like an arrow. She'd been avoiding this possibility, refusing to acknowledge what they both knew was coming. Otis's good days were becoming rarer, his confused episodes longer and more frightening. Soon, she might be caring for a man who looked like her husband but couldn't remember their life together. "Then I'll remember for both of us," she said. "That's not fair to you." "Fair?" Charlotte turned from the window, anger flaring in her chest. "What's fair about any of this? What's fair about loving someone for 43 years and then having a stranger walk in and demand you choose between duty and survival?" "Charlotte, no." She held up her hand. "I married you for better or worse, in sickness and in health. I didn't add conditions about debt collectors or failing mines or whether it was convenient. But if there was a way to save the homestead and get me proper care, at the cost of my freedom, at the cost of everything we've built together." Charlotte felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. "Otis, this man isn't offering to help us. He's offering to break us apart and call it mercy. Maybe mercy comes in forms we don't expect." The words hit her like a slap. She stared at her husband, this man she'd loved through young passion and middle-aged partnership, and now into the twilight of their lives, and saw something that terrified her more than Montgomery Blackwell's ultimatum. She saw doubt, not about her love for him, but about whether that love was enough to justify the sacrifice he saw her making. "Don't you do this," she said quietly. "Don't you start thinking you're not worth fighting for. I'm not the man you married, Charlotte. Half the time I can't remember what day it is, and it's only going to get worse." Otis's voice broke. "Maybe it would be kinder to both of us if—" "Stop." Charlotte knelt beside his chair and took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You are the man I married. You're the man who built this cabin with his bare hands, who kept me safe through 100 winter storms, who saved my life by riding through the night to find medicine. The fact that you sometimes forget which tool does what doesn't change any of that, but caring for me is going to kill you. And leaving you would kill me just as surely." She kissed his forehead, tasting salt from tears she hadn't realized were falling. "We're going to find another way, Otis. We have to." But even as she spoke the words, Charlotte felt the weight of impossible. Mathematics pressing down on her shoulders. $8,000 might as well be 8 million. 3 days might as well be 3 minutes. And somewhere down the valley, Montgomery Blackwell waited with the patience of a man who held all the cards. That night, Charlotte lay awake, listening to Otis's breathing and trying to imagine a future that didn't end in catastrophe. She thought about the young woman who'd married a mountain man and followed him into the wilderness, trusting that love would be enough to build a life on. She thought about the middle-aged woman who'd weathered droughts and blizzards and the gradual understanding that they'd never have children to carry on their name. And she thought about the woman she was now 68 years old, still strong but not young, still vital but not naive about what the future held for people like them. Somewhere in the darkness before dawn, Charlotte admitted to herself what she'd been refusing to acknowledge. They had no good choices. They had only degrees of loss, different ways of breaking apart the life they'd built together. The question wasn't whether they could avoid disaster. The question was what form that disaster would take and whether love could survive whatever choice she made. Outside, the wind sang its eternal song through the pines, and the promissory note lay on the kitchen table like a challenge to everything Charlotte had believed about the permanence of the life they'd built. 3 days. She had 3 days to decide whether love meant holding on or letting go. 3 days to choose between loyalty and survival, between the past and an unimaginable future, between the woman she'd always been and the woman Montgomery Blackwell seemed to think she could become. 3 days to answer a question she'd never thought she'd have to face. What did she owe to love, and what did love owe to her? Charlotte's mother's locket felt cold against her palm as she sat by the kitchen window, watching. The first pale light of dawn touched the peaks. She'd retrieved it from the small jewelry box on her dresser, a silver pendant that had belonged to 3 generations of women before her, each one forced to make impossible choices in their own time. Inside the locket, a faded daguerreotype showed her mother's young face, serious and determined. Margaret O'Brien had been 19 when she'd followed her husband west, leaving behind everything familiar to build a life in country that killed the weak and unprepared. She'd buried 2 children on the trail, given birth to Charlotte in a soddy on the plains, and somehow found the strength to keep moving toward whatever tomorrow might bring. A woman's strength isn't in her muscles, her mother had told her once, polishing this same locket while Charlotte watched from the kitchen table of their first Montana cabin. It's in her ability to bend without breaking, to choose what matters most when everything she loves is at stake. Charlotte had been 16 then, restless and eager for adventure, impatient with her mother's quiet wisdom. Now, 52 years later, those words felt like prophecy. She'd barely slept, her mind circling endlessly around Montgomery Blackwell's ultimatum. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw different futures herself, growing old alone while caring for Otis as his mind slipped further away, or herself in some distant city wearing silk dresses while Otis died forgotten in a pauper's asylum. Neither vision offered comfort. "You're up early." Otis appeared in the doorway, already dressed in his work clothes, despite the fact that winter offered little outdoor work. His face held the confusion that often marked his mornings now, as if he had to remember each day who and where he was. Couldn't sleep. Charlotte slipped the locket back into her pocket. "Coffee's ready." She watched him move through their morning routine, noting how he hesitated at each small task. The coffee cup seemed unfamiliar in his hands, the sugar bowl a puzzle to be solved. On his bad days, even the simplest domestic rituals became challenges that frustrated and frightened him. "That man," Otis said suddenly, "the one who came yesterday, was he real?" Charlotte's heart clenched. "Yes, he was real." "Good. Sometimes I can't tell anymore." Otis sat heavily in his chair. "What did he want?" She explained again about the debt, watching his face cycle through confusion, memory, and fresh horror, as if hearing the news for the first time. This was their new reality. Every conversation might need to be repeated, every plan explained again and again, as his mind struggled to hold on to the threads of their shared life. "How much money?" he asked. "More than we have. More than we could ever have. Then we're going to lose the homestead. Maybe." Charlotte couldn't bring herself to mention Montgomery's alternative proposal. Not yet. Not while Otis was struggling just to understand their basic situation. After breakfast, she walked through their small cabin with new eyes, taking inventory of everything they'd accumulated over 4 decades of mountain life. The hand-carved furniture that had seemed so precious yesterday now looked like what it was, the work of an amateur woodworker making do with what materials he could find. Beautiful to them, but worthless to anyone else. Her grandmother's china, carefully preserved through countless moves and harsh winters, might bring $50 to the right buyer. The silver-backed brush set from their wedding could be worth a bit more. But even their most valuable possessions added up to perhaps $200, a fortune to them once, but meaningless against an $8,000 debt. "We could sell the South 40, Otis suggested when she returned to the main room. He was having one of his clearer moments, his eyes focused and present. "Keep the land around the cabin. Who would buy it? It's nothing but timber and rock, no road access. Maybe someone who wants to log it." Charlotte considered this. The South 40 held some decent pine, but getting logs out would require building roads through terrain that had defeated better men than themselves. Any logging company would offer pennies on the dollar for such difficult access. "Even if we could find a buyer, it wouldn't be enough," she said gently. "Then, what about—" Otis stopped, his face clouding with confusion again. "What were we talking about?" "Nothing important." Charlotte squeezed his shoulder. "Why don't you rest while I figure out what to make for dinner?" But instead of planning dinner, she found herself standing in their bedroom, staring at the wardrobe that held her few good dresses. 3 garments suitable for town visits or church services, all carefully mended and preserved, but clearly the clothing of a mountain woman rather than someone accustomed to finer things. She pulled out her best dress, dark blue wool with mother-of-pearl buttons, and held it up to the mirror. The woman looking back at her had weathered 68 years of hard living, but she wasn't broken. Her hair was more silver than brown now, her hands marked by decades of work, her face lined by weather and worry. But her eyes remained clear and intelligent, and she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd never backed down from a challenge. Was this the woman Montgomery Blackwell saw? This mountain wife who'd never owned anything finer than homespun, never traveled farther than the county seat, never had any ambition beyond building a good life with the man she loved. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Charlotte quickly hung the dress back in the wardrobe and went to answer it, expecting to find one of their few neighbors. Instead, Montgomery Blackwell stood on her threshold again, hatless this time, his dark hair touched with silver in the morning light. "Mr. Blackwell, she didn't invite him in." "You said 3 days." "I did. I'm not here to pressure you for an answer." He shifted slightly, and she noticed he carried a leather satchel. "I brought something I thought you might want to see." Despite herself, curiosity won. She stepped aside to let him enter, noting how he removed his boots without being asked and waited for permission before sitting down. Whatever else he might be, he understood mountain courtesy. "What did you bring?" she asked. Montgomery opened the satchel and withdrew a photograph in a silver frame, a formal portrait of a woman perhaps 40 years old, with kind eyes and an intelligent face. She wore an elaborate dress that spoke of wealth and position, but her expression held warmth rather than hauteur. "My wife, Catherine," he said quietly. "She died 3 years ago. Consumption." Charlotte studied the photograph, seeing in the woman's face something she recognized, the quiet strength of someone who'd learned to make the best of whatever life offered. "I'm sorry for your loss. She was the finest person I ever knew, patient, kind, endlessly generous." Montgomery's voice carried genuine grief. "We were married 23 years, and I thought we'd have at least 20 more. Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to understand that this isn't about replacing her. No one could do that." He took the photograph back, handling it with obvious care. "But she taught me something important about love, that it doesn't diminish when you share it. That caring for someone doesn't mean you have less care to give." Charlotte felt a flush of anger. "You think I don't know that? You think 43 years of marriage didn't teach me about love?" I think you've spent 43 years giving everything to one man and never considering what you might want for yourself. Montgomery's voice remained calm, reasonable. I'm offering you the chance to find out. At the cost of abandoning my husband, at the cost of choosing your future instead of just accepting it. He stood, moving to the window that looked out over the valley. Mrs. Brennan, how many times have you been farther than Millerville? The question caught her off guard. That's not, how many books have you read that weren't about practical things like farming or medicine? How many conversations have you had with people who could challenge your mind instead of just sharing local gossip? Each question hit like a small wound, exposing desires Charlotte had buried so deep she'd almost forgotten they existed. She had been curious once, eager to learn about the world beyond their mountain. But survival had demanded all her energy, leaving little room for dreams that served no practical purpose. You don't know anything about my life, she said. I know you've been lonely. The words were spoken gently, but they cut deep. Not for lack of love, but for lack of intellectual companionship. I can see it in the way you've arranged your books, in the care you take with your speech. You're an intelligent woman who's been trapped in circumstances that never challenged her mind. My husband challenges me. Your husband is a good man who's losing himself piece by piece. Montgomery turned from the window to face her directly. And you're losing yourself trying to hold on to someone who's already slipping away. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Charlotte felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Get out, she said quietly. Mrs. Brennan, get out of my house. Her voice was stronger now, edged with fury. Come back in 2 days for your answer, but don't come back before then. Montgomery nodded, collecting his hat and satchel. At the door, he paused. I'm not your enemy, Charlotte. I'm just a man who recognizes what he sees and isn't afraid to reach for it. After he left, Charlotte stood in her kitchen, feeling as if the walls were closing in around her. The cabin that had always felt like sanctuary now seemed small and confining. The mountains that had sheltered them now felt like prison walls. She touched the locket in her pocket, thinking of her mother's words about bending without breaking. But what happened when the choice wasn't between bending and breaking, but between two different ways of shattering everything you'd built your life around? Outside, snow began to fall again, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled on silent wings, hunting for prey that had nowhere left to hide. The foundation stone bore their initials still, carved deep into granite the summer they'd first broken ground for the cabin. Charlotte knelt beside the massive boulder that formed the southeast corner of their home, tracing the letters with her fingertip. O, B, plus, C, O. 1882. Below that, in Otis's careful script, forever and always. She'd been 25 then, newly married and drunk with the possibility of building something permanent in a world that seemed designed to tear everything apart. Otis had been 28, all lean muscle and quiet determination, convinced that love and hard work could conquer anything the wilderness threw at them. Forever seemed a lot shorter back then, she murmured to herself. The night had been brutal. Charlotte had lain awake listening to Otis thrash restlessly beside her, muttering fragments of conversations with people who existed only in his fading memories. Twice he'd gotten up and wandered toward the door, confused about where he was or why he was inside when he should be checking trap lines that hadn't existed for 15 years. This morning, he was having what she'd come to think of as a clear day, one of those increasingly rare times when the fog lifted from his mind and she glimpsed the man she'd married. He sat at the kitchen table now, coffee growing cold in his hands, staring at the promissory note with full understanding of what it meant. I remember everything, he said quietly. The debt, the railroad man, what he wants from you. Charlotte felt her heart clench. The clear days were almost worse than the confused ones because they forced both of them to confront the full scope of their disaster without the merciful haze of forgetting. We'll find another way, she said, though the words felt hollow. No, we won't. Otis set down his cup and looked directly at her. Charlotte, I've been thinking about this all night, and there's something I need to say while my mind is working right. Otis, let me finish. Please. His voice held an urgency that stopped her protest. I've been selfish. For months, maybe years, I've been selfish. You haven't been. I have. He stood and walked to the window that looked out over the valley they'd claimed as their own. I've been so afraid of losing you that I haven't been thinking about what this life is costing you. Charlotte felt something cold settle in her stomach. This life is what we chose together. We chose it when we were young and strong, and I could provide for us. We chose it when my mind was sharp and my hands were steady. Otis turned back to her, and she saw tears in his eyes. But circumstances change, Charlotte. People change. And sometimes love means admitting when the dream isn't working anymore. Stop. The word came out sharper than she'd intended. Don't you dare start talking like we're finished. Look at me. Otis's voice was gentle but implacable. Really look at me. Half the time I don't know what year it is. I forget your name sometimes. Forget where we are. Forget that we're married. Yesterday I spent an hour looking for my father, and he's been dead 20 years. Each word hit like a physical blow, but Charlotte forced herself to listen. What happens when winter comes and I wander outside without my coat because I think it's summer? What happens when I forget how to bank a fire or think you're a stranger who's broken into our house? Otis's voice broke. What happens when you're not just my wife anymore, but my keeper? Then that's what I'll be, Charlotte said fiercely. Whatever you need me to be, that's what I'm afraid of. He moved back to his chair, suddenly looking older than his 71 years. You've spent 43 years taking care of me, Charlotte. Taking care of our home, our land, our life together. When's the last time someone took care of you? The question hit closer to home than she wanted to admit. Charlotte tried to remember the last time she'd been sick enough to stay in bed, the last time someone else had cooked her meals or worried about her comfort. The memories stretched back decades. That's what marriage is, she said, taking care of each other. But I can't take care of you anymore. I can barely take care of myself. Otis reached across the table and took her hands. And this Montgomery Blackwell, whatever else he might be, he's offering you something I can't give you anymore. What's that? A future where you're not slowly dying of exhaustion and heartbreak. Charlotte pulled her hands free and stood up abruptly, needing to move, needing to do something with the energy that was building inside her like steam in a kettle. She walked to the kitchen window and stared out at their land, the garden plot where she'd coaxed vegetables from stubborn soil, the barn where they'd sheltered livestock through countless storms, the meadow where they'd picnicked during their early years when the world had seemed full of endless possibility. You want me to abandon you, she said. I want you to save yourself. By going with a stranger, by leaving everything we've built together, by choosing life over loyalty. Otis's voice was steady now, resolved. Charlotte, if you stay here with me, you'll spend the next 5 or 10 years watching me disappear piece by piece. You'll feed me and dress me and clean up after me and try to pretend I'm still the man you married. And when I finally die, you'll be alone on this mountain with nothing but memories and regrets. And if I go with Montgomery, then maybe you'll have a chance to be more than just my caretaker. Maybe you'll have a chance to be yourself again. Charlotte felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. You make it sound like caring for you would be a burden. Wouldn't it be? The question hung in the air like smoke. Charlotte wanted to deny it, wanted to insist that love made any sacrifice bearable. But she thought about the sleepless nights, the constant vigilance, the gradual erosion of her own identity as Otis's needs consumed more and more of her energy. Even if it was, she said finally, it would be my burden to carry. But what if you don't have to carry it alone? The voice came from the doorway, and Charlotte spun around to see Montgomery Blackwell standing there. She'd been so absorbed in their conversation that she hadn't heard him approach. What are you doing here? She demanded. I told you not to come back for 2 days. I apologize for the intrusion. Montgomery stepped into the room, removing his hat. "But I was visiting the Peterson place and thought I should clarify something about my proposal." "There's nothing to clarify," Charlotte said coldly. "I think there is." Montgomery looked between her and Otis. "I think you're both operating under a misunderstanding about what I'm offering." "You're offering to buy my wife," Otis said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "I'm offering to provide care for both of you." Montgomery's voice remained calm. "Mrs. Brennan wouldn't be abandoning you, Mr. Brennan. She'd be ensuring that you receive the best possible care while also giving herself a chance at a different kind of life." Charlotte felt the world tilt slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean medical care from doctors who specialize in conditions like your husband's. I mean a comfortable facility where he'd be safe and well tended while you—" Montgomery paused, choosing his words carefully. "While you explore what else life might have to offer." "An asylum," Otis said flatly. "A private sanitarium with the finest care money can buy." Montgomery's voice held no apology. "Where he'd be surrounded by trained professionals instead of slowly deteriorating in isolation." Charlotte felt sick. The image of Otis in some distant institution, surrounded by strangers who didn't know his history or understand the man he'd been, was almost unbearable. "And me?" she asked. "You'd be free to discover who you are when you're not defined entirely by your role as caretaker." Montgomery moved closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "When's the last time you read a book for pleasure, Charlotte? When's the last time you had a conversation about ideas instead of just daily necessities? When's the last time you made a choice based on what you wanted instead of what duty demanded?" Each question was a small knife wound, exposing desires she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten they existed. But beneath the pain, Charlotte felt something else stirring anger. "You think you can solve everything with money," she said. "You think you can buy solutions to problems you don't understand. I think money can provide options you don't currently have." Montgomery's voice remained infuriatingly reasonable. "And I think love sometimes means making difficult choices for the people we care about." "Don't talk to me about love," Charlotte snapped. "You don't know the first thing about it, don't I?" Montgomery pulled out the photograph of his wife again. "I spent 3 years watching consumption eat away at the finest woman I ever knew. 3 years of helplessness while she slowly suffocated in her own lungs. You think I don't understand what it means to watch someone you love disappear?" The pain in his voice was genuine, and it stopped Charlotte's angry response before it could form. "The difference is," Montgomery continued, "when Catherine was dying, I had every resource in the world at my disposal, and it still wasn't enough. You're facing a different kind of loss, but you don't have to face it with empty hands." "So this is charity?" Charlotte's voice was ice. "This is recognition." Montgomery put the photograph away. "Recognition that some people are worth saving, even when they don't think they deserve it." "I don't need saving." "Everyone needs saving, Charlotte. The question is whether we're brave enough to accept it when it's offered." After Montgomery left, Charlotte and Otis sat in silence for a long time. The foundation stone was still visible through the kitchen window, solid and permanent, as the day Otis had carved their initials into its surface. But permanence, Charlotte was learning, was an illusion. Everything changed, everything eroded, everything eventually returned to dust. The only question was what you chose to build while you still had time. Montgomery's pocket watch caught the firelight as he sat across from Charlotte at their kitchen table, the golden surface reflecting memories she couldn't see. He'd returned that evening with an invitation to dinner, a formal request delivered with the courtesy of a gentleman caller rather than the demands of a creditor. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the timepiece. Charlotte nodded, curious despite herself. Montgomery opened the watch with practiced care, revealing an inscription etched into the inner cover in delicate script. "To my dearest Montgomery, may every moment we share be precious. Your devoted Catherine." "She gave it to me on our first anniversary," Montgomery said quietly. "Said she wanted to be with me even when business kept us apart." Charlotte studied his face as he spoke, noting the way his expression softened when he mentioned his wife's name. Whatever else Montgomery Blackwell might be, his grief was genuine. "How long were you married?" she asked. 23 years. We met when she was 19 and I was 25, a railroad man's daughter who thought she could civilize a young entrepreneur with more ambition than sense. A smile touched his lips. She was right, mostly. What was she like? Intelligent, patient, endlessly curious about the world. Montgomery closed the watch carefully. She spoke 3 languages, read everything she could get her hands on, and had opinions about subjects most women of her station never considered. She challenged me in ways I didn't know I needed. Charlotte felt a stab of something that might have been envy. To be challenged intellectually, to have someone who cared about your thoughts as much as your domestic capabilities, she'd almost forgotten what that might feel like. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I want you to understand that I'm not looking for a replacement wife or a pretty ornament for my house." Montgomery's dark eyes met hers directly. "I'm looking for companionship, for someone who might appreciate the same things Catherine did: books, music, conversation, the luxury of exploring ideas for their own sake. And you think I'm that person? I think you could be, given the opportunity." Before Charlotte could respond, a crash came from the bedroom, followed by Otis's confused voice calling her name. She hurried to find him standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by the contents of their dresser drawers. Clothing lay scattered across the floor, and he was holding one of her chemises with obvious bewilderment. "Charlotte, there's someone in our room. A woman left her things here." Her heart broke a little more. "Those are my things, Otis. I'm Charlotte." He stared at her for a long moment, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I don't know what I thought." "It's all right." She guided him back to bed, picking up the scattered clothing. "Just a bad moment. They pass." But when she returned to the kitchen, Montgomery was standing by the window with an expression she couldn't quite read. He'd witnessed the entire episode, seen the full scope of what her daily life had become. "How often?" he asked quietly. "More and more." Charlotte sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted. "Some days he knows me perfectly. Other days I'm a stranger who's invaded his home. Last week he tried to protect me from myself in a mirror. You can't manage this alone much longer. I've been managing it for 2 years, and it's killing you." Montgomery returned to his seat. "Charlotte, forgive my bluntness, but you look like you haven't had a full night's sleep in months. When's the last time you left this mountain for more than a few hours?" She tried to remember and realized it had been over a year since she'd made the trip to Millerville. Otis couldn't be left alone anymore, and their few neighbors were busy with their own struggles. "You're isolated here," Montgomery continued, "completely cut off from everything that might nourish your mind or spirit. How much longer can you sustain this? As long as necessary. But what if it's not necessary? What if there's another way?" Montgomery reached into his jacket and withdrew a small leather portfolio. "I took the liberty of making some inquiries about private care facilities. There's a place outside Denver, the Mountain View Sanitarium. It specializes in patients with conditions like your husband's." Charlotte's first instinct was to refuse to look, but curiosity won. The photographs showed a beautiful facility nestled in rolling hills, with manicured gardens and spacious rooms filled with natural light. Well-dressed staff attended to patients who looked comfortable and cared for. "They have doctors who've made careers of studying the mind," Montgomery explained. "Nurses trained specifically for these conditions. Activities designed to preserve dignity while ensuring safety. It looks expensive." "It is, but money isn't a consideration." Charlotte studied the photographs, trying to imagine Otis in such a place. Would he be happier there, surrounded by people who understood his condition, or would the unfamiliar surroundings only increase his confusion? "And what would happen to me while he's there?" she asked. "You'd discover who you are when you're not defined entirely by your caretaking role." Montgomery's voice was gentle. "You'd have time to read, to think, to explore interests you've had to set aside. You'd have conversations with people who challenge your intellect instead of requiring constant care. With you, among others, I have friends, men and women of education and culture, who would welcome someone of your obvious intelligence. Montgomery paused. Charlotte, when's the last time you discussed philosophy, or literature, or current events? When's the last time someone asked for your opinion on something other than household management? The questions hit home with painful accuracy. Charlotte couldn't remember the last time she'd had a real conversation about ideas, the last time someone had been genuinely interested in her thoughts rather than her services. You think I'm some sort of intellectual trapped in domestic circumstances, she said. I think you're a woman who's had to suppress parts of herself to survive, and I'm offering you the chance to rediscover them. A sound from the bedroom interrupted them, Otis calling out in distress. Charlotte found him sitting on the edge of the bed, weeping quietly. I can't remember her name, he said when he saw her. The woman I married. I love her so much, but I can't remember her name. Charlotte, she said gently, sitting beside him. Her name is Charlotte, and she loves you too. Charlotte. He repeated the name like a prayer. She's beautiful, isn't she? And kind. I hope I've been good to her. You have. You've been very good to her. When she returned to the kitchen, Montgomery was standing by the door, hat in hand. I should go, he said. You have enough to deal with tonight. Mr. Blackwell Montgomery. She struggled with what she wanted to say. Why me, really? You could have any woman you wanted, someone younger, more cultured, more suitable to your station. He considered the question seriously. Because when I look at you, I see someone who's been tested by life and emerged stronger rather than broken. I see intelligence that's been dormant but not destroyed. I see grace under pressure and dignity in the face of impossible circumstances. He paused. And because I see someone who deserves better than slow martyrdom disguised as love. After he left, Charlotte sat alone in her kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the life she and Otis had built together. The hand-carved chairs, the carefully preserved china, the books arranged with loving care on their shelves, everything spoke of decades of shared effort and mutual devotion. But beneath the familiar comfort, she felt something stirring that terrified her more than Montgomery's ultimatum. It was the whisper of possibility, the dangerous thought that maybe, just maybe, there could be more to life than endless sacrifice. That night, she lay awake listening to Otis's restless breathing and found herself imagining a different kind of existence. A life where she could read books for pleasure rather than necessity, where she could engage in conversations that challenged her mind, where she could be Charlotte the woman rather than Charlotte the caregiver. The guilt that followed these thoughts was crushing, but she couldn't push them away entirely. They'd taken root in the secret places of her heart, and like all growing things, they demanded light and space to flourish. Outside, snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the darkness, a future she'd never imagined waited like a thief in the night, ready to steal everything she thought she knew about: love, duty, and the price of happiness. The hand-carved chess set had been Otis's wedding gift to her in their second year of marriage, 32 pieces, shaped from mountain pine during the long winter evenings, when snow trapped them inside for weeks at a time. Each piece bore the careful attention of a man who worked with his hands for love rather than profit, the crude but heartfelt artistry of someone who'd never been taught proper technique but possessed infinite patience. Charlotte traced the worn surface of the White Queen, remembering countless evenings when she and Otis had matched wits across this board. He'd been a formidable opponent in those days, his mind as sharp as his trapping instincts, able to see 3 moves ahead and anticipate her strategies with uncanny accuracy. Now the board sat forgotten on its shelf, gathering dust like so many other remnants of their shared intellectual life. "You're thinking again," Montgomery observed from his chair by the fire. He'd taken to visiting in the evenings, ostensibly to check on their situation, but increasingly to engage Charlotte in the kind of conversations she'd almost forgotten were possible. Is that unusual? For you, no, but you have a particular expression when you're wrestling with something important. He gestured toward the chess set. Tell me about that. Charlotte lifted the set down and placed it on the table between them. Otis made it for me. We used to play almost every night during the winter months. Who won more often? He did, in the beginning, but I learned. She set up the pieces with practiced efficiency. Toward the end, before his mind started failing, we were evenly matched. And now he can't remember how the pieces move. Charlotte's voice caught slightly. Last month I tried to teach him again, thinking it might help stimulate his memory. He became so frustrated he swept the board clear and wouldn't speak to me for hours. Montgomery studied the board, noting the careful craftsmanship despite the amateur execution. He must have spent months on this. All winter, I'd wake up and find him at the kitchen table, working by lamplight before dawn. Charlotte picked up a knight, running her thumb over its carved mane. He said he wanted to give me something that would challenge my mind, something we could share when the work was done and the evenings stretched long. It sounds like a perfect gift. It was. She set the knight back in place. We'd sit here planning strategies, debating moves, talking about everything and nothing. Some of my happiest memories are of those games. What did you talk about? Charlotte considered the question. Books we'd read, ideas we'd encountered, plans for the homestead. Dreams, sometimes. Foolish dreams about traveling, about what we might see if we ever left this mountain. Those don't sound foolish to me. They were for people like us. We had everything we needed here: work, shelter, each other. What more could we want? Experiences, knowledge, the stimulation that comes from encountering new ideas and different perspectives. Montgomery leaned forward. Charlotte, when's the last time you had a conversation that surprised you? When's the last time someone said something that made you reconsider a belief you'd held for years? The question stung because she couldn't remember. Life on the mountain had narrowed to immediate necessities: weather, supplies, Otis's care. There was no room for abstract thought, no energy for intellectual curiosity. I think I've forgotten how, she admitted. I don't believe that for a moment. Montgomery gestured toward her carefully organized bookshelf. A woman who arranges her books by subject and keeps them in perfect condition hasn't forgotten how to think. She's simply been denied the opportunity. Before Charlotte could respond, a terrible crash came from the kitchen, followed by Otis's voice, raised in confusion and anger. She rushed to find him, standing amid the shattered remains of their dinner plates, blood running from a cut on his hand where he'd tried to clean up the mess. I was trying to help, he said, his voice breaking. I wanted to set the table for dinner, but I couldn't remember which plates we use, and then they all looked strange to me, like they belonged to someone else. Charlotte's heart shattered along with the china. These were the plates they'd used for special occasions, the few fine things they'd managed to accumulate over 4 decades of careful living. Now they lay in pieces, victims of a mind that could no longer distinguish between familiar and foreign. It's all right, she soothed, guiding him away from the broken crockery. Accidents happen. But as she bandaged his hand, Charlotte felt something inside her break as cleanly as the plates. This was their life now, not just the confusion and forgetfulness, but the destruction of everything they'd built together, piece by piece, memory by memory. Montgomery appeared in the kitchen doorway, taking in the scene without comment. When Charlotte looked at him, she saw not pity but understanding, the recognition of someone who'd watched his own world crumble, despite all his efforts to hold it together. "Let me help," he said quietly, and began carefully collecting the larger pieces of broken china. "You don't need to." Catherine broke a vase once during her illness, he said, continuing to work. It had belonged to her grandmother, been in her family for 3 generations. She wept for hours, not because of the vase, but because her hands had betrayed her, because her body was no longer reliable. Charlotte watched him work, noting the care with which he handled even the smallest fragments. "What did you do?" "I held her while she cried, and then I swept up the pieces and never mentioned it again." Montgomery straightened, his hands full of broken pottery. Sometimes love means pretending that what's lost doesn't matter, even when it breaks your heart. Later, after Otis had been settled for the night and the kitchen restored to order, Charlotte and Montgomery sat by the fire in contemplative silence. The chess set remained on the table between them, a bridge across the growing chasm of her divided loyalties. "Play with me," she said suddenly. Montgomery looked surprised, but moved to the chair across from her. "It's been years since I've played." "Then we're evenly matched." Charlotte turned the board so that he had the white pieces. "Your move." They played in comfortable silence, the familiar rhythm of strategy and counter-strategy, providing a respite from the impossible decisions that haunted Charlotte's waking hours. Montgomery proved to be a thoughtful player, not brilliant, but careful and methodical, willing to sacrifice minor pieces for strategic advantage. "You're better than you claimed," Charlotte observed as she studied the board. "You're considerably better than I expected." Montgomery captured one of her pawns. "Where did you learn to play like this?" "Otis taught me, but I learned from books. We had a volume on chess strategy that I read until the pages fell apart." Charlotte moved her bishop into an attacking position. "I used to dream about playing in tournaments, testing myself against real masters." "You still could." The casual comment hit her like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "There are chess clubs in Denver, Charlotte, formal competitions, people who would appreciate your skill and welcome your participation." Montgomery's voice was carefully neutral. "You could discover how good you really are." Charlotte stared at the board, seeing not just the game before her, but a vision of herself in an elegant room, surrounded by serious players who cared nothing about her domestic skills, but everything about her ability to think strategically. The image was so vivid, so appealing, that it terrified her. "Check," Montgomery said, quietly. Charlotte looked down to find her king threatened, trapped between her own pieces with no easy escape. Like the game, like her life, the position seemed hopeless until she noticed a possibility she'd overlooked, a desperate gambit that might save everything or lose it all. "You're trying to seduce me," she said, not looking up from the board. "I'm trying to show you possibilities you've forgotten existed, with games and books and intellectual companionship, with the chance to discover who you might be if you weren't defined entirely by your circumstances." Montgomery leaned back in his chair. "Charlotte, you're one of the most intelligent people I've ever met, but you've been buried under 40 years of survival. I'm offering to help you excavate yourself." Charlotte moved her queen, a bold sacrifice that opened up new possibilities across the board. "And what do you get in return?" "The pleasure of watching someone remarkable remember that she's remarkable." Montgomery studied her move with obvious admiration. "And perhaps, eventually, companionship with someone who can challenge me the way Catherine did." "I'm not Catherine." "No, you're not. You're Charlotte, someone who's been tested by hardship and emerged stronger, someone who's learned to find beauty in simple things without losing her hunger for something more." Montgomery met her eyes across the board. "Someone worth saving, even if she doesn't believe it herself." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both that winter was far from over. But inside, by the fire, with the chess pieces arranged in careful battle across the board between them, Charlotte felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the pure pleasure of intellectual engagement, the joy of being seen and appreciated for her mind rather than her domestic capabilities. It was a dangerous feeling, she realized, more dangerous than Montgomery's money or his promises of comfort, because it reminded her of who she'd been before. Circumstance reduced her to nothing more than a caretaker, and it whispered seductive possibilities about who she might still become. The game continued late into the night, neither player willing to concede, both understanding that they were playing for stakes far higher than victory on a wooden board. The hidden deed lay buried beneath years of accumulated papers in the bottom drawer of Otis's old desk, a document so carefully concealed that Charlotte had forgotten its existence, until desperation drove her to search every corner of their home for anything of value. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the yellowed parchment, reading words that changed everything she thought she knew about their situation. Mineral rights, Grant Wildcat Ridge Mining District, the document proclaimed in formal legal script. This deed conveys to Otis Brennan and his heirs all subsurface mineral rights to the property described herein, including but not limited to precious metals, coal, oil, and any other valuable substances contained within the boundaries of the aforementioned 40 acres. Charlotte sank into Otis's chair, her mind reeling. According to the deed, they owned not just the surface of their land, but everything beneath it, rights that could be worth thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of dollars, depending on what lay hidden in the mountain's heart. She found Otis in the kitchen, staring out the window with the vacant expression that marked his worst days. But when she placed the deed before him, something flickered in his eyes, a spark of recognition that sent hope flooding through her chest. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice suddenly clear. "In your desk." "Otis, why didn't you tell me about this? We could have sold these rights years ago, paid for my medicine without borrowing from anyone." Otis touched the document with reverent fingers, and Charlotte watched 40 years of pride and stubbornness play across his weathered features. "Because this land is ours, Charlotte, our legacy. I couldn't bear the thought of strangers tearing it apart for what they might find underneath. But you were willing to borrow money instead. I thought," he struggled with the memory, "I thought I could pay it back from trapping, from good seasons and careful living. I never meant for it to grow so large." Charlotte studied the deed more carefully, noting the date 1879, 3 years before they'd built their cabin. "How did you get this?" "Bought it from a prospector who'd given up on the mountain. Cost me 2 years' savings, but I had a feeling about this place." Otis's eyes cleared further, memory sharpening. "Found some promising signs over the years, quartz veins with gold traces, coal seams in the eastern ridge. Never pursued them because I didn't want to destroy what we'd built." "And you hid this from me for 46 years? I meant to tell you, but then we got settled, built our life, and it seemed like something that could wait. I put it away for safekeeping and just forgot about it, I suppose." Charlotte felt a complex mixture of relief and anger flooding through her. Relief that they weren't as helpless as she'd believed. Anger that Otis's secretiveness had led them to this crisis. But beneath both emotions, a more troubling thought was beginning to form. "Otis," she said carefully, "when Montgomery Blackwell loaned you that money, did he know about these mineral rights?" Otis's face clouded with confusion. "I don't remember." "Maybe?" He asked a lot of questions about the land, about what made me choose this particular mountain. Charlotte's blood turned cold. A successful railroad baron didn't get rich by making careless investments or charitable loans. If Montgomery had researched their property before, offering credit, and any prudent businessman would have, he would have discovered the mineral rights, which meant he'd known all along that they possessed the means to repay his loan, which meant his current ultimatum was something else entirely. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her racing thoughts. Through the window, she saw Montgomery riding up their trail, his usual composed expression giving no hint of the revelation awaiting him. Charlotte folded the deed carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket, her mind working furiously. "Mrs. Brennan," Montgomery said as she opened the door, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I thought we should discuss the practical arrangements for tomorrow's decision." "Of course." Charlotte's voice remained steady, despite the turmoil in her chest. "Please, come in." Montgomery entered and nodded politely to Otis, who was regarding him with the wary confusion that strangers often provoked. "I've taken the liberty of arranging transportation to Denver. Montgomery continued. If you decide to accept my proposal, we could leave as early as next week. How thoughtful of you to plan ahead. Charlotte poured coffee with mechanical precision, using the routine to mask her racing thoughts. Tell me, Mr. Blackwell, how long have you known about our mineral rights? The coffee cup paused halfway to Montgomery's lips. For just a moment, his composed mask slipped, revealing something that might have been guilt or calculation. Then his expression smoothed again, but Charlotte had seen enough to confirm her suspicions. I beg your pardon, he said. Charlotte pulled the deed from her pocket and placed it on the table between them. Our mineral rights, the ones that make us considerably wealthier than either of us realized until an hour ago. Montgomery studied the document without touching it, his face revealing nothing. Where did you find this? Hidden in my husband's desk. The question is, why you didn't mention it when you offered to loan him money 8 years ago. I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm implying that you researched our property before making any financial arrangements. I'm implying that you've known all along we could repay your loan whenever we chose to. Charlotte's voice grew harder. I'm implying that your ultimatum has nothing to do with debt collection and everything to do with something else entirely. Montgomery was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those intelligent dark eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness she hadn't heard before. Yes, he said simply, I knew about the mineral rights. The admission hit Charlotte like a physical blow, even though she'd been expecting it. Then why? Because 8 years ago, when your husband came to me desperate to save your life, I glimpsed something I thought I'd lost forever. Montgomery's composure finally cracked, revealing the lonely man beneath the wealthy facade. I saw what real love looked like, what a man would sacrifice to protect the woman he cherished. And I envied him more than I've ever envied anyone. So you decided to take me away from him? I decided to offer you a choice you'd never had. Montgomery stood and walked to the window, his back to her. Charlotte, you've spent your entire adult life in service to others, first to survival, then to your husband, then to his failing health. When have you ever chosen something purely for yourself? That's not how marriage works. Isn't it? My wife chose me every day for 23 years, not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire for partnership. She could have had any life she wanted, but she chose the life we built together because it fulfilled her. Montgomery turned back to face her. Can you say the same? The question cut deeper than Charlotte wanted to admit. Had she chosen this life, or had she simply accepted it as the only option available to a young woman with limited prospects? Had she stayed on the mountain from love, or from lack of alternatives? You manipulated us, she said, deflecting the uncomfortable. Self-examination. You created a crisis that didn't need to exist. I created an opportunity for you to see your situation clearly. Without external pressure, would you ever have questioned whether this life is truly what you want? This life is what I have, what we built together. And what if you could build something different? Something that honored your intelligence as much as your loyalty, that challenged your mind as much as it protected your heart. Montgomery's voice grew urgent. Charlotte, you could sell a fraction of those mineral rights and live comfortably for the rest of your life. You could provide the finest care for your husband while also claiming a future for yourself. With you, if you chose that. But the choice would be yours, made freely rather than from desperation. Charlotte stared at the deed lying on the table between them, a piece of paper that represented freedom from the impossible debt that had driven her to consider abandoning everything she'd ever known. With it, she could pay Montgomery and send him away, could maintain the status quo and continue caring for Otis until his condition claimed them both. But the deeper question remained, did she want to? I need time to think, she said. Of course. Montgomery moved toward the door, then paused. Charlotte, I want you to know that discovering those mineral rights doesn't change my feelings. I'm not interested in your newfound wealth. I have more money than I can spend in a lifetime. I'm interested in you, in the remarkable woman who's been hidden under layers of duty and sacrifice. And if I choose to stay, then I'll honor that choice and disappear from your life forever." Montgomery's voice was soft but firm. "But I hope you'll consider what you're choosing. Not just what you're choosing between, but what you're choosing for." After he left, Charlotte sat staring at the deed that had changed everything and nothing. They were no longer trapped by debt, but she remained trapped by something far more complex, the weight of 43 years of shared history. The love she still felt for the man Otis had been, and the growing recognition that love alone might not be enough to sustain her through the years ahead. Otis had fallen asleep in his chair, his face peaceful in repose, and Charlotte found herself studying him with new eyes. This man had been her whole world for most of her adult life. But what would happen when that world inevitably contracted to the size of a sick room, to the endless repetition of care and confusion and slow decline? The mineral rights offered freedom from financial worry, but they couldn't restore Otis's failing mind or give Charlotte back the intellectual companion she'd lost. They couldn't erase the loneliness that had been growing inside her like a cancer or answer the question that Montgomery had forced her to confront. What did she want for herself, separate from what duty demanded? Outside, snow began to fall again, and Charlotte realized that all the money in the world couldn't change the fundamental choice she faced. The debt had been a distraction, a practical problem that masked the deeper question of whether love meant holding on or letting go, whether loyalty required sacrifice of self or preservation of it. Tomorrow she would have to choose not between poverty and security, but between the safety of the known and the terrifying possibility of becoming someone she'd never allowed herself to imagine. Charlotte's grandmother's quilt lay spread across their bed like a map of family history, each patch telling the story of a dress worn to church, a child's outgrown shirt, a tablecloth saved from better days. 3 generations of women had added to its pattern, creating something beautiful from fragments of lives lived and lost. Now Charlotte sat beside it, running her fingers over stitches sewn by hands long since turned to dust, and wondered what her grandmother would have made of the choice before her. The night had been endless. After discovering the mineral rights and confronting Montgomery about his deception, Charlotte had lain awake, wrestling with questions that had no comfortable answers. The deed sat on her kitchen table like an accusation, proof that their crisis had been manufactured, that the choice she faced had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with desire. She could pay the debt. She could send Montgomery away. She could continue caring for Otis until his condition claimed them both, secure in her righteousness and slowly dying of spiritual starvation. Or she could admit what she barely dared think, that part of her wanted to go. "You're awake early." Otis appeared in the bedroom doorway, his face holding the temporary clarity that sometimes graced his mornings. "Couldn't sleep?" "Too much thinking." Charlotte patted the quilt beside her. "Come sit with me." He settled onto the bed with the careful movements of a man whose body had begun betraying him in small ways. For a moment, they sat in silence, surrounded by the weight of 43 years of shared mornings, shared decisions, shared life. "I remember this quilt," Otis said suddenly. "Your grandmother was working on it the first time I came calling. She made me sit in the parlor for an hour while she decided whether I was worthy of her granddaughter. She liked you. Eventually, after I convinced her, I wasn't just another drifter looking for easy comfort." Otis touched one of the patches, a piece of blue calico from Charlotte's childhood dress. "She told me that women in your family were strong, but that strength could be a burden if it wasn't balanced with wisdom." "What did she mean? That you'd spend your life taking care of everyone else if someone didn't teach you to take care of yourself too?" Otis's voice grew soft with memory. "I promised her I'd make sure you had room to grow, room to become whoever you were meant to be." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes. "You did. We built a good life together. We built a survival, Charlotte. A necessary, honorable survival. but not necessarily the life you might have chosen if you'd had real options. The admission hung between them like smoke. Charlotte stared at her husband, this man she'd loved through passion and partnership, and now into the gradual dissolution of everything they'd shared, and saw that his clarity extended beyond the present moment to encompass the entire arc of their relationship. "Otis, let me finish. Please." His hand found hers on the quilt. "I've been thinking about this all night, and I need to say it while my mind is working right. That railroad man Montgomery, he's not wrong about everything. He manipulated us. He created this crisis deliberately. Yes, he did, but that doesn't make his offer worthless any more than his methods make your feelings invalid." Otis turned to face her fully. "Charlotte, when's the last time you laughed? Really laughed, not just polite amusement, but the kind of joy that bubbles up from somewhere deep inside?" She tried to remember, and couldn't. Laughter required lightness of spirit, freedom from constant worry, space for happiness that served no practical purpose. When's the last time you bought something beautiful instead of useful? When's the last time you spent an entire day doing exactly what you wanted instead of what needed to be done? Otis's questions came gently but relentlessly. When's the last time you felt like Charlotte the woman instead of Charlotte the caretaker? Each question was a small knife wound, exposing desires she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten they existed. Charlotte had been a caretaker for so long that she'd lost track of who she might be without someone to tend. "That's not your fault," she said. "Isn't it? I brought you to this mountain, Charlotte. I convinced you that isolation was romantic, that we could build paradise with nothing but love and hard work. I never asked if you wanted paradise, or if you wanted it here. I was happy here. You were content here. There's a difference." Otis stood and walked to the window that looked out over the valley they'd claimed as their own. "Contentment is a good thing, Charlotte, but it's not the same as fulfillment. And maybe after 43 years of contentment, you deserve a chance at something more." Charlotte joined him at the window, studying the landscape that had shaped every day of their married life. Snow covered everything in pristine white, making the world look clean and simple, but she knew the reality hidden beneath the rocks that broke plowshares, the slopes too steep for cultivation, the isolation that could kill as surely as any disease. "Are you asking me to leave you? I'm asking you to choose yourself for once instead of choosing duty." Otis's voice was steady, resolved. "And if choosing yourself means accepting Montgomery Blackwell's offer, then I want you to do it with my blessing instead of my resentment. I can't abandon you." "You wouldn't be abandoning me. You'd be ensuring that I receive proper care while giving yourself permission to discover who you might become with room to breathe." Otis took her hands in his trembling ones. "Charlotte, I've been selfish. I've held on to you out of love, yes, but also out of fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of facing this illness without your strength to lean on. But that's not fair to either of us. We made vows. We made vows to honor each other, to support each other's highest good, to love each other enough to want what's best, even when it's difficult." Otis's eyes were clearer than she'd seen them in months. "What's best for me is proper medical care, and the peace of knowing you're living instead of just surviving. What's best for you is the chance to discover who Charlotte Brennan might be when she's not defined entirely by her circumstances." A knock at the door interrupted them. Charlotte went to answer it, unsurprised to find Montgomery standing on their threshold. He looked tired, as if he'd slept as poorly as she had, and his usual confidence seemed tempered by uncertainty. "I've come for your answer," he said without preamble, "not because I'm impatient, but because I think the waiting is harder than the choosing." "Come in." Charlotte stepped aside, noting how Montgomery nodded respectfully to Otis before taking his seat at their kitchen table. The mineral rights deed still lay where she'd left it, a paper barrier between what was and what might be. "I suppose you're wondering what I've decided," Charlotte said. "I'm wondering if you've been able to see past the method to the opportunity." Montgomery's voice was carefully neutral. "I know my approach was calculated, perhaps even cruel. But the choice itself is real, Charlotte, and so are the possibilities it represents. Tell me about these possibilities, specifically. Charlotte sat across from him, the deed between them like a contract waiting to be signed or torn apart. What exactly are you offering? Partnership, Montgomery said simply. Not marriage, not some arrangement where you're purchased like property, but genuine partnership between two intelligent adults who've both learned something about loss and resilience. What would that look like? A home in Denver where you'd have your own rooms, your own space, your own identity separate from mine. Access to cultural opportunities, theater, lectures, musical performances, a library that would challenge your mind and conversations that would stretch your thinking. Montgomery paused. And yes, eventually, if we found we suited each other, perhaps something deeper, but that would be your choice, made freely over time. And Otis? The finest care money can provide, with your input on every decision regarding his treatment. You could visit as often as you wished, participate in his care as much as you wanted. He wouldn't be abandoned, Charlotte, he'd be properly supported while you explored what else life might offer. Charlotte looked at her husband, seeing in his face not jealousy or resentment, but something that looked remarkably like relief. Otis? What do you think? I think you've spent 43 years putting everyone else's needs before your own, and it's time someone put your needs first. His voice was steady, certain. I think Montgomery Blackwell sees something in you that you've forgotten how to see in yourself. And I think, his voice broke slightly, I think I love you enough to want you to be happy, even if that happiness doesn't include me. Charlotte felt the last of her resistance crumbling, not because Montgomery's offer was irresistible, but because the man she'd loved for most of her life was giving her permission to love herself as well. I need one more night, she said. One more night to be certain. Of course, Montgomery stood, moving toward the door. But Charlotte, don't choose based on what you think you owe to the past. Choose based on what you want to give to the future. After he left, Charlotte and Otis spent the day moving through their familiar routines with new awareness. Every shared task, every small kindness, every moment of connection carried the weight of potential goodbye. But beneath the sadness, Charlotte felt something else beginning to bloom, a fragile hope that choosing herself didn't have to mean destroying everything she'd loved. That evening, as they sat by the fire with the chess set between them, Charlotte realized that some games couldn't be won or lost, only played with courage and honesty until all the pieces had found their proper places. Tomorrow she would have to choose. Tonight, she would simply love the man who'd given her permission to love herself as well. The cabin's key felt heavier than iron in Charlotte's palm as she stood in the doorway of the home she'd shared with Otis for 43 years. He'd forged this key himself in their early days, hammering hot metal into shape during the long winter evenings when there was little else to do but dream of the life they were building together. Now, it felt like both a burden and a blessing, the weight of everything she was choosing to leave behind, and the promise of everything she might discover beyond these walls. It's time, Otis said gently from behind her. His voice carried the strange peace that had settled over him since giving her his blessing to go. Montgomery will be here soon. Charlotte turned to look at her husband one last time in the home they'd created together. The morning light streaming through their handmade windows touched his weathered face with gold, and for a moment she saw not the confused, failing man he'd become, but the fierce young trapper who'd won her heart with his quiet strength and gentle humor. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good," Otis said, moving to stand beside her. "Being scared means you understand the magnitude of what you're choosing. But being brave enough to choose anyway, that's what makes it worthwhile." They'd spent the night talking, really talking, perhaps for the last time. Otis had been lucid throughout, his mind clear as mountain water, and they'd shared memories and hopes and fears with the honesty that comes when there's nothing left to lose. He'd told her about his proudest moments and his deepest regrets, She'd confessed dreams she'd never spoken aloud, desires she'd thought buried beyond recovery. "Promise me something," Charlotte said, taking his hands in hers. "Promise me you'll let the doctors help you. Don't fight the treatment because you think you deserve to suffer." "I promise." Otis squeezed her fingers gently. "And you promise me something too. Promise you'll give yourself permission to be happy. Don't carry guilt about this choice like a stone in your heart." "I don't know if I can." "You can. You're the strongest person I've ever known, Charlotte Brennan. Strong enough to build a life in the wilderness, strong enough to nurse a dying woman back to health, strong enough to care for a man whose mind is leaving him piece by piece." Otis's voice grew firm. "And strong enough to choose hope over duty when hope offers the chance for something better." Charlotte had packed her few belongings in the carpet bag that had carried her possessions west as a young bride. It seemed fitting that the same bag would carry her toward whatever future awaited. She'd taken her mother's locket, her grandmother's brush set, the blue dress she'd worn to their wedding, and the few books that had sustained her through the loneliest years. Everything else belonged to the life she was leaving behind. "The mineral rights papers are in the kitchen drawer," she said. "Sell whatever you need to for your care. The rest can wait until—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Until I don't need it anymore," Otis completed gently. "Charlotte, what happens to the money after I'm gone doesn't matter. What matters is that you're living a life worth living while you still can." The sound of approaching horses reached them through the morning air. Montgomery had come for her answer, and Charlotte realized with crystal clarity that her choice had been made sometime during the long night of conversation and honest reckoning. Not from desperation or manipulation, or even from Montgomery's considerable persuasion, but from the simple recognition that she deserved more than slow martyrdom disguised as love. "He's here," Otis said. Charlotte picked up her carpetbag, testing its weight. 43 years of life reduced to what she could carry in one hand, but somehow that felt right. She was leaving with less than she'd brought, but she was taking something infinitely more valuable, the hard-won knowledge of who she was and what she was capable of surviving. "I love you," she said to Otis. "I need you to know that this choice doesn't change that. I love you, I'll always love you, and part of me will always be here in this cabin with the man who built it for me." "I know." Otis touched her face with trembling fingers. "And I love you enough to want you to discover what else you might love, given the chance." Montgomery's knock came soft but firm. Charlotte opened the door to find him standing hat in hand, his expression carefully neutral. He'd dressed for travel, practical clothes that spoke of a man prepared for whatever decision awaited him. "Mrs. Brennan," he said formally, "have you reached a decision?" "I have." Charlotte stepped back to let him enter, noting how his eyes immediately sought hers, searching for the answer he hoped to find. "Mr. Blackwell, I've decided to accept your offer." Something like relief flickered across Montgomery's features, followed immediately by what looked like gratitude. "I'm honored by your trust," he said simply. "This isn't about trust," Charlotte replied. "This is about choice. For the first time in my adult life, I'm making a choice based on what I want rather than what duty demands. And what do you want, Charlotte?" She looked around the cabin one last time, taking in the hand-hewn beams, the carefully preserved books, the chess set still arranged on its table. Then she looked at Otis, who was watching her with pride and love, and the kind of unselfish blessing that comes only from the deepest devotion. "I want to discover who I might become when I'm not defined entirely by my circumstances," she said. "I want to find out what Charlotte Brennan is capable of when she's given room to breathe." "Then that's what we'll discover together," Montgomery said. "Shall we go?" Charlotte picked up the cabin key and held it out to Otis. "This will always be my home," she said, "but it doesn't have to be my prison." Otis's wedding ring caught the morning light as he slipped it from his finger. The gold band worn thin by decades of mountain work and weathered by time until it seemed more like a piece of the landscape than jewelry. Charlotte watched in stunned silence as he held it out to her, his eyes clear and purposeful despite the tremor in his hands. "Take this," he said quietly. "Not to remember me by you'll never forget me, and I'll never forget you, no matter what this sickness takes from my mind. Take it as proof that love doesn't end when circumstances change." "Otis, I can't." "You can, and you will." His voice carried an echo of the authority he'd once wielded in the wilderness, when his word had meant the difference between survival and death. "Charlotte, this ring has been on my finger for 43 years. It's part of me, just like you're part of me. But love isn't about possession, it's about blessing." Charlotte's vision blurred with tears as she accepted the ring, feeling its familiar weight settle into her palm. She'd watched this band catch firelight during countless evening conversations, had felt it against her skin during their most intimate moments, had seen it flash in sunlight as Otis worked to build their life together. Now it felt like a sacred trust, a tangible reminder of everything they'd shared and everything they were choosing to release. "I feel like I'm betraying everything we built together," she whispered. "You're honoring it." Otis moved to the window, gazing out at the valley that had been their world for so long. "Charlotte, what we built here wasn't just a homestead or a marriage or even a life together. What we built was the foundation that made you strong enough to make this choice." Montgomery stood quietly by the door, understanding instinctively that this moment belonged to Charlotte and Otis alone. His presence felt respectful rather than intrusive, patient rather than eager. Whatever else he might be, he recognized the weight of what was happening and honored it accordingly. "Every lesson you learned on this mountain, every challenge you survived, every moment of joy we shared, all of it has prepared you for this," Otis continued. "You think you're leaving our life behind, but you're carrying the best of it with you." Charlotte closed her fingers around the ring, feeling its warmth from Otis's body heat. "What if I'm making a terrible mistake? What if I regret this choice?" "Then you'll make another choice. That's what courage looks like, Charlotte, not the absence of doubt, but the willingness to act despite it." Otis turned back to her, and she saw in his face the same fierce protectiveness that had once made him legendary among the mountain men. "For 43 years, I've been proud to be your husband. Now I'm proud to be the man who loves you enough to let you go." The words hit Charlotte like a physical blow, beautiful and terrible in their finality. She understood now that this wasn't abandonment, it was the ultimate expression of the love they'd shared, refined by suffering into something pure and selfless. "I don't know how to say goodbye to you," she said. "Then don't." Otis moved to her and gathered her into his arms one last time, and Charlotte felt herself memorizing the feel of his embrace, the familiar scent of pine and wood smoke that always clung to his clothes, the way his chin rested against the top of her head. "This isn't goodbye, Charlotte. This is until we meet again." They held each other in the cabin they'd built with their own hands, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived fully despite its hardships. The handmade furniture bore witness to their love. The carefully tended books spoke of shared winter evenings. The very walls seemed to pulse with decades of laughter and tears and quiet companionship. "I'll write to you," Charlotte said into his shoulder. "I'll tell you about everything I see, everything I learn. You'll still be part of my life, even if," she couldn't finish, "even if I don't remember your letters, I'll know they're from someone who loves me." Otis's voice was steady, certain, and that will be enough. When they finally separated, Charlotte saw that Montgomery had moved to the kitchen table where the mineral rights deed still lay. He'd produced a pen and was making notations on a separate document. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Ensuring that your husband's care is properly funded from your mineral rights," Montgomery replied without looking up. "These papers will guarantee that he receives the finest medical attention available, regardless of the progression of his condition." Charlotte felt a new wave of gratitude toward this complex man who was giving her a future while ensuring that her past was honored. "Thank you. It's a practical arrangement, nothing more." But Montgomery's voice carried warmth that belied his words. "Are you ready?" Charlotte picked up her carpet bag and walked to the door, pausing for one last look around the cabin that had been her entire world. Then she stepped outside into the crisp mountain air, feeling the weight of Otis's ring in her pocket and the even greater weight of the choice she was making. Behind her, framed in the doorway of their home, Otis raised his hand in farewell. The gesture was simple, dignified, and achingly final, the blessing of a man who understood that true love sometimes required the courage to let go. Charlotte climbed onto the horse Montgomery had brought for her, settling her skirts with hands that shook only slightly. As they rode away down the mountain path, she didn't look back. Some goodbyes were too sacred to be witnessed twice. The letter in Charlotte's hands bore the careful script of a woman who had learned to write with purpose rather than mere decoration. 3 months had passed since she'd left Wildcat Ridge, and the paper before her represented something she'd never imagined possible: correspondence with the life she'd chosen to leave behind. But correspondence that spoke of peace rather than anguish. "My dearest Otis," she read aloud to Montgomery, who sat across from her in the sunlit parlor of his Denver home. "I hope this letter finds you well and that Mrs. Peterson is taking good care of you until the arrangements for Mountain View are complete." Montgomery looked up from his morning paper, noting the calm way Charlotte spoke her husband's name. In the weeks since her arrival, he'd watched her grief transform from raw wound to gentle ache, her guilt dissolve into something that looked remarkably like gratitude. "The doctors here have examined me thoroughly," Charlotte continued reading, "and while they can offer no miracle cures, they assure me that proper care can slow the progression of his condition. Dr. Harrison speaks with such kindness about his patients, and the facility truly is as beautiful as the photograph suggested." She paused, looking out the window at the bustling city below. Denver in 1925 was a revelation to a woman who'd spent 4 decades in mountain isolation, electric lights that banished the tyranny of darkness, streetcars that made the city accessible in ways she'd never imagined, and people everywhere, a constant stream of humanity with stories and dreams and purposes that had nothing to do with mere survival. "I think he would approve of this choice," she said to Montgomery. In his letter last week, he seemed almost relieved that the burden of care would soon pass to people trained for it. "And how do you feel about it?" Charlotte considered the question seriously. Montgomery had learned to value her thoughtful responses, her way of examining ideas from multiple angles before settling on truth. "I feel like I'm discovering muscles I'd forgotten I had, not physical muscles but intellectual ones, emotional ones, the parts of myself that had atrophied from disuse." It was true. In 3 months, Charlotte had attended more cultural events than in the previous 10 years combined. She'd heard symphonies that moved her to tears, attended lectures that challenged assumptions she hadn't even known she held, and engaged in conversations that stretched her mind in ways she'd forgotten were possible. "Tell me about the library visit yesterday," Montgomery prompted, settling back into his chair with the expression of a man who genuinely enjoyed the stories she brought home from her explorations. "I spent 4 hours there and barely noticed the time passing." Charlotte's eyes lit with enthusiasm that made her look years younger. "They have an entire section devoted to Western history books written by people who lived through the same era we did, but from such different perspectives. Reading their accounts is like seeing my own life reflected in a dozen different mirrors." "And the chess club?" "Humbling," Charlotte laughed, a sound that had become more frequent and more genuine as the weeks passed. "I won 2 games out of 6, but I learned more in those losses than in 20 years of playing with just Otis." Montgomery watched her face as she spoke, noting the animation that had replaced the careful guardedness of her early weeks in Denver. She'd been suspicious at first of his motives, of her own desires, of the very idea that someone like her belonged in his world. But gradually, like a flower turning towards sunlight, she'd begun to bloom. "There's something else," Charlotte said, her tone growing more serious. "Something I need to tell you." Montgomery set aside his paper, giving her his full attention. Over the months, he'd learned to recognize when she had something important to say. "I've been thinking about what this arrangement is," she continued, "what we are to each other. When I first came here, I thought of myself as a refugee from circumstances beyond my control, someone you'd rescued from an impossible situation. And now I think we're two people who've both learned something about loss and found something about possibility." Charlotte leaned forward slightly. "Montgomery, I'm grateful for what you've given me, the chance to rediscover parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. But I don't want to remain forever grateful. I want to contribute something meaningful to this partnership. What did you have in mind?" Charlotte reached for a different letter, one that had arrived in the Morning Post. "I've been corresponding with the Denver Women's Literary Society. They're looking for someone to organize their Frontier Women's Project, collecting and preserving the stories of women who helped settle the West." Montgomery's eyebrows rose. "And they've offered me the position. It would mean travel, interviews with women across the territory, real work that uses everything I've learned about survival and adaptation." Charlotte's voice grew stronger. "I want to accept." "Then you should. It would change things between us. I wouldn't be the rescued woman you brought to civilization. You'd be Charlotte Brennan, historian and documentarian, making a contribution to preserving an important part of our region's heritage." Montgomery smiled. "Which sounds considerably more interesting than Charlotte Brennan, grateful refugee." 6 weeks later, Charlotte received the letter that changed everything once more. It came from Dr. Harrison at Mountain View, written in the careful prose of a man accustomed to delivering difficult news with compassion. "Mr. Brennan passed peacefully in his sleep on the evening of April 15th, she read to Montgomery over breakfast. His final days were comfortable, and he spoke often of his wife Charlotte, always with great love and pride. His last words were, "She chose well." Charlotte set the letter aside and sat quietly for a long moment, feeling the complicated grief of losing someone she'd already learned to love from a distance. Otis was gone, but his blessing remained, his final affirmation that her choice had been right. "He knew," she said finally. Somehow, he knew that this was what love looked like, not holding on, but letting go with grace. Montgomery reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Over the months, their relationship had evolved from desperate arrangement to genuine partnership, based not on rescue or manipulation, but on mutual respect and growing affection. "What would you like to do now?" he asked gently. Charlotte looked around the room that had become home, filled with books and morning light, and the comfortable silence of two people who'd learned to appreciate each other's company. Then she thought of the work waiting for her, the stories of frontier women that needed preserving, the life she was building that honored both her past and her future. "I'd like to live," she said simply, "really live the way Otis always wanted me to, the way I'm finally brave enough to try." Outside, the city hummed with possibility, and Charlotte Brennan, widow, historian, and woman finally discovering who she might become, prepared to embrace whatever came next with the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd learned that love sometimes meant choosing hope over habit, growth over stagnation, and the courage to become rather than the comfort of simply being. In her pocket, Otis's ring rested warm against her heart, not a chain binding her to the past, but a blessing carrying her toward a future bright with unexpected promise.